Hello, so I'm Alex Penn here again, and welcome to session 2 of Industrial Ecology and Human Ecosystems Design. So in this session, we're going to be thinking about a design approach to putting together industrial ecosystems. So this design approach is known as human ecosystems design, whole systems design, or permaculture design. So you might have come across some of those terms in the past. So I'll just give you a brief overview of where that kind of design methodology came from, and then I'll talk to you about the design cycle that we use when we're putting together these kinds of whole systems designs. I'll take you through the first few stages of that, which is what we'll be doing this week, surveying the system that we're going to design and then doing analysis on that system so that we can effectively design. I'll take you through a couple of design tools, and you'll be using those in your session. I've provided handouts so that you can be taken through that process. So that will be input-output analysis and looking at the resources and limiting factors in the system that you'll be designing. I'll talk to you a little bit about your design brief and the map, just to make sure that that's quite clear. Okay, so the design methodology that we're going to be using in order to think about our industrial ecosystems is permaculture design. So that's also known as human ecosystems design or whole systems design, and you might have come across some of those terms before. So permaculture is a design method that was invented by two forestry ecologists in Australia in the 1970s, so Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, who you can see in the picture there. And it's basically a systems design methodology which is based on the structure and dynamics of woodland ecosystems, in which you have numerous species interacting together, waste products being used as inputs for different species, and many mutualisms or beneficial connections. So effectively, the idea is that we can consider our own systems as ecosystems in the same way. If we think about an ecosystem more generally, components of our human systems could be considered species with inputs and outputs and properties, and we can connect them together to design our own human ecosystems that meet our needs effectively, but also which are sustainable, resilient and self-supporting systems, so using inspiration from the way that these natural ecosystems work. And you can see immediately how this connects to the concepts that we've already discussed in industrial ecology with industrial symbiosis, in which waste products from one company are used as a virgin resource for another company, and we create beneficial connections of inputs and outputs between companies, either material connections or social or economic connections. So what do we try to do in permaculture design? So, as I said, it's about emulating natural systems but producing our own ecosystems. So from these woodland ecosystems, permaculture draws several design principles or heuristics, and these are what I want you to apply when you're designing your own industrial ecosystems. So the first principle, which we've really already come across, is this energy and material cycling. So really this is the very core of this design methodology. Every output in a woodland ecosystem, every waste product is effectively used for food for another organism in the system. And we have a big cyclic metabolism. Not only do we have many trophic levels in which one organism itself will be food for another, then we also have the decomposed bodies of organisms or parts of plants or what have you will be food sources for other sets of organisms. All the nutrients tend to be held in the bodies of the living organisms for the most part, and the nutrients are cycled round and round. And if you remember going back to the concept of linear versus cyclic metabolism that we already talked about, then here we do have a cyclic metabolism. The only energy really coming in is energy from the sun, and everything else is being cycled round. We don't have enormous runoff of nutrients from our system. We also see numerous beneficial connections or mutualisms in these kinds of systems. So the obvious example, of course, always used is pollination. So insects pollinate plants, which is of course beneficial to the plant, but in return they get nectar. So many mutualisms by which two organisms associated benefit each other from the relationship have evolved in these systems. Another key mutualism would be mycorrhizal fungi in the forest floor, which attach to tree roots. The tree feeds them sugar from photosynthesis, and they bring in phosphates from the soil for the trees. Symbiosis or mutualism is very ancient in these kind of ecosystems. The chloroplasts and the leaves of the plants, for example, and the mitochondria were originally free-living bacteria, and they effectively have been provided a stable environment inside the cells of these plants or multicellular organisms in return for providing material outputs. So sugars, of course, in the case of the chloroplasts. Another very important point to note in these kinds of systems is that we have many different sorts of species, and there are many different niches. So every organism in a system like this creates a niche just by being there. So it's producing outputs which can be used as food. So that creates niches. It's taking in inputs, things that it needs, things that it be connected to. This sort of defines its niche. But also, additionally, just properties of the organisms. The fact that the tree casts shade, for example, creates the optimal environment for another organism to live in. So all of these niches or ways of living are used in this system. This allows an enormous diversity of organisms to exist. And it also means that many different yields are produced from this system. Not just material yields, but we can think of broader things as yields, for example, the shade of the tree. So, and species here tend to have many different functions. They tend to interact with each other in many different ways, ultimately to create a huge, interconnected, innovative, very rich and evolving system of biomass, a very productive system. Compared to its inputs, a woodland ecosystem in terms of the biomass it produces is far, far more productive than conventional agricultural systems. So, we're going to try to use these design principles to design our own industrial ecosystem. So, what we're really thinking about is constructing a cyclic or circular metabolism within an industrial region. And going back to the very basics, we'll be thinking firstly about industrial symbiosis, so how the outputs or wastes of one company can become inputs for another, and will make beneficial connections between companies in the ecosystem. And those beneficial connections can be quite broad. We ideally, with our design and with the connections we make, we're trying to satisfy the triple bottom line. So obviously reusing a waste product as a resource can have environmental benefits because we're not sending waste to landfill or polluting the atmosphere, and it also can have economic benefits, although we may need to adjust taxes and regulations to make that happen. So it usually saves one company money in terms of waste disposal or resource costs. But we also really want to think about the social pillar of sustainability. What sorts of connections can we make in our ecosystems to make have positive social impacts? So the connections that we make can either satisfy all three of these criteria simultaneously, or we think about different criteria satisfying, different connections satisfying these different criteria. So, permaculture design, in trying to do this, in trying to put these ecosystems together, we go through a very defined design process, a design cycle, and it's quite important that we stick to this design cycle because basically it allows us to do good design. We have what's known as the 80-20 principle in permaculture, that we spend 80% of our time on our initial stages surveying, looking at the system and what's already there and really trying to pull out all of the elements that are in the system, what's the context of the system and its constraints and resources. So really trying to go through that and really map the system effectively. And then moving on to analysis or analysing the system, thinking about all of the elements in the system and what their inputs and outputs are, thinking about whether those are met within the system or not, where are leaks within the system, where a resource is being lost, but really trying to go through an analytical process to see how this functions already as an industrial ecosystem. And only then, once we've gone through these two stages, which is where our 80% of our time should be going, do we move on to the design stage of the process. And this basically allows us to do much more effective design work that uses the properties of the system effectively, that works with the dynamics of the natural system or the system itself as it's working, and make decisions that will work properly in the context that we're looking at, rather than just imposing ideas from the outside without proper consideration. You're going to be designing an industrial ecosystem which is actually based on my region of study, the Humber estuary in the north of England. This is there's Yorkshire on the north bank and Lincolnshire on the south bank here. This is the UK's biggest bulk port and a hub of power generation for the UK. 17% of the UK's electricity is generated in this region. 23% of its CO2 emissions are produced here. And it also has about a third of the UK's gas landings and oil refinery capacity. But it's really trying to develop as a productive industrial ecosystem and move towards sustainability, move towards new technologies such as renewables and bio-based economy. The region also has a lot of problems, a lot of unemployment based on the collapse of the fishing industry and on traditional manufacturing industries in this region. So it's quite economically depressed, but it also has a lot of resources, farmland, very extensive farmland, the sea, access to all of these skills and industry that are pre-existing. So, I'm giving you, in the course of your session, you'll get a design brief and you'll get a large copy of this map. So the design brief goes into a lot more detail about this region and how it works and what the issues are. And the map, of course, contains references to different elements, as we call them, that are in the region. So what I want you to first do, going through the surveying stage of your design, is to list the current system elements and their inputs and outputs. So you'll have a sheet which will specifically designed for this, which will frame this for you. So elements can be anything in the system. So factories, companies, farmland, the university, the river, anything that's there in the system. So firstly, I want you to list all of the elements that you can see in that design, and then list their inputs and outputs. And then I want you to start thinking about the context of this system. So there's some detail on the design brief about the context, but it might be easier for you to start thinking about as if this were your own country and your own region, if it relates at all to that. So think about what is the economic context here, what are the demographics, what's the political environment. These are things we often call invisible structures in permaculture design. So they make an enormous difference on how our design is going to work. Then think about listing the resources and constraints in the system. So think very broadly about what resources are. Resources aren't just material things. They can be skills, people, a political environment, everything that you can think of in that system that is in some way a resource that you could use and makes an impact on your design. And then think about constraints. This follows, again, really from the context that you've been thinking about and from the inputs and outputs that you've been thinking about. What are the things that will limit you in the freedom of choice to make any kind of design decisions? Are these regulatory factors? Is it money? Is it high unemployment? Are there certain physical characteristics of the environment that mean that there are only certain things that you can do? So really try to get a feel of how the system is already working. And just to try to make that clear, So in terms of the elements, we're thinking about, of course, things like the different factories. These are elements in our systems: oil refineries, chemical plants, biofibrous production. But things like farmland, a town, but also what comes with those things, what's in the towns, what, the people that are there, who are the demographics. Start to think about these elements and start to write them on the post-it notes that you'll be provided with. Don't start to write these things yet on your map, but start to construct a list of what you've got. Okay, so we start to move on from a surveying stage to analysis. So one of the key types of analysis that we do, and sort of the most basic type, is input-output analysis. So this is not the same as the classical economic input-output analysis, just to clarify that. But it's really just thinking about what elements need in order to function and what materials, energy and skills, everything that they need. And then the outputs, what does the element produce and how does it behave? So including products, wastes, energies, effects on the environment, anything that the element can produce. Is, as I said previously, can be extremely broad. Maybe the operation of this plant is producing in some way knowledge, employment, leisure, community benefits. Really try to think as broadly as possible about what the outputs and inputs of any given element in your system are. And as I said, write this down on the element analysis sheet. Anything that doesn't fall, obviously, into the category of an input or output, potentially functions or characteristics of your elements. So make a note too about what are the essential characteristics here. You're going to work with those as well. Ultimately, we're going to use this as we want to connect outputs to inputs to make beneficial connections. So as we kind of move through the analysis, go to that list that you just produced, and you'll see that there's a tick box for each input and output. And what you need to think about is, for every input that each element in the system has, is that input or need, if you like, being met from within the system, or is it being imported? So just tick the box if the element is, if its need is being met from within the system. If the needs are not being met, think about where they're coming from. And the same with the outputs. Are the outputs of these elements being used within the system? So, or are they just actually becoming a pollution and having to be exported somewhere? I mean, one of the key things to try to remember in this kind of design is that unmet needs or inputs correspond to work that we have to do, energy or money that we have to put in order to meet them, and unused outputs correspond to pollution or waste, and that's what we're trying to prevent. So doing this kind of analysis then allows you to go a bit further and start to think about what are the kind of flows that you've got going on in your system. What are the key flows in terms of materials, energy, money, information, people, whatever it might be, and what are the leaks? Where are resources leaving the system? What are the key losses that you see in the system, and what are the gaps? Now, again, moving further through your sort of analytical stage, we want to return to resources and limiting factors. So I asked you to think extremely broadly about what resources and limiting factors are. But what we always try to do in this kind of design is think about, firstly, are we using all of our resources, all of these broad categories of resources? And then can we work with our limiting factors or see them differently? So again, as I said, both of these categories are very broad, not just materials or energy, but social and political. And then we start to go through this process. Can we turn our constraints into resources? So, we might have a very windy site. We might have fixed our mind on the fact that we want to grow non-hardy crops there, so it's a limiting factor. But in actual fact, the wind might be an opportunity for turbines and for energy generation. We try to fit our system to what we have available to us. Think about all of your constraints. Can you use them as resources? Even things that seem very negative, unemployment and a pool of people without jobs. Actually, maybe this creates an opportunity to set up projects for people to get involved, or for skills training. That pool, there's an untapped resource there. So really go through your list of constraints and think, okay, how could I turn this around? If you really can't think about a way to turn it around, think about what you might have to do in order to mitigate or ameliorate the negative impact. Okay, so having gone through this, you've thought about your inputs and outputs, you've identified gaps, flows and leaks, and you've thought about what the system gives you, what the resources are and what the constraints are and how you might be able to use those. This basically allows you to decide on strategies or themes. These are the broad overarching themes of what you want to focus on in your design. So think about what the system wants, what you've got from your design brief, what people want there, and then think, okay, I'm going to come up with strategies which would better use flows in this system or redirect them so as to close resource loops and to plug the leaks effectively in the system. And these strategies should be using the resources that you've got available, turning the limiting factors into resources or reducing their impacts, making the best use of what you've got, and of course aiming to satisfy this triple bottom line: environment, economic and social benefits, all very important in systems like this. So you'll spend the whole session really going through that survey and analysis process, and then next time you'll actually come on to starting to do the design. And I'm really asking you to stick to this process, stick to this analytical process, and not start to sort of draw things on your map or make design decisions at this stage. Because it's very easy in designing to just have your own ideas in mind. I'd really like to see an anaerobic digester, for example. That's my favourite technology. And then before you've even evaluated whether that's appropriate or useful in this context, it's in your design. And once you've written that onto your map, it's surprising how stuck you get, how that then influences everything that you next do. So go through the process, evaluate everything that's there and how it can best be used, and very importantly, stop yourself from designing too early. Don't just put in your own ideas. Work out what would be best with the context. And that's the reason, for example, why when we're doing our analysis and we're writing down our elements and our flows and what have you, we do it all on separate pieces of paper. We'll do it on post-it notes that you can stick onto your map, but then you'll be able to move those around and experiment with them. You won't have constrained yourself by starting to draw on the map already. So this might seem a bit counterintuitive for people with a design background, but I'm asking you really to just experiment with the approach and see what different sorts of outcomes you get from it.